How you doing? It's Frank Zaylor again, and this is part two. The last episode we talked about engine displacement, valve train, lightness of valve train, cubic inches. What we're going to do this is we're going to talk about making sure everything's right. Even if I get a set of cylinder heads that are fresh from the machine shop, whether they're stock heads or whether they're Ched Spire race heads, I take them completely apart. Human error, parts that aren't just quite right. There's too many variables that can happen. I had a set of heads once that I pulled the valves out, and the valve stem to guide was so tight on a brand new set of heads that I usually had to use I had to use a small punch to actually punch the valves out. Okay? Now, would it have worked on a regular street motor at low RPMs? Maybe. So I instantly took them apart, took them over to my buddy, and he honed the guides. Okay? It's just things that you don't know, things that you need to check. Okay? Let me give you a quick example. I'm putting together a 4.7 for a friend of mine. It's just a stock replacement 4.7, and it broke a connecting rod. Well, I got a block, and I got the crankshaft that came, that was the crankshaft with the broke rod. And I inspected everything pretty good, and I found some marks on the crankshaft. Now, the marks weren't on the bearing surface, so at first look, you go, oh, okay, this crank should be fine. I stuck it in the block, torqued it down, spun like a Swiss watch, no problem. When I went to put this motor together, I pushed the piston in, and it didn't want to go in right. There's spacers between the rod journals on a 4.7 motor. And after looking at it very carefully, I noticed when the broken rod hit it, it actually smashed it a little bit. And what that did is took up all the bearing clearance, or not the bearing clearance, all the side clearance for the rod. So what I did is I took it apart and I followed it down and put it back together. I still didn't like it. I ended up putting it together twice, and I still wasn't happy with it. I had a helper helping me, and I said, well, go ahead and pull it back out. And he goes, and his reasoning was, no, I'm out, I'm done. Okay, that's what happens. Okay, you try to fix something once or twice, and you lose patience in it, or you say it should be okay. It's not. Don't fucking do it. Okay? If there's something wrong, fucking fix it. Don't put a broke part in. Don't put a tight part in. Don't put a questionable part in. I promise you, it will fuck you every single time. Okay? On the third time when I pulled it out, I actually broke out some air tools, and I scuffed up the rod the way I wanted to. And when we got done with it, when I put it back in, after I cleaned it up, it fit like a glove. And it spun the way I wanted it to spin. Okay? Now, I spent, believe it or not, about an hour trying to get one rod to fit. Okay? If you don't have the patience to do that, or you think you have the patience to do that, you'll catch yourself doing it. Okay? Don't. Okay? A lot of times what happens is when you go put a motor together, most freshly built motors are built tight. And they're built tight for a reason. They're built tight because a lot of people will put them on street cars, and they're going to go run them for 30, 50, 80,000 miles. That's fine and dandy. And you have a long break-in procedure, and you do that. That has nothing to do with what I'm speaking about right now, okay? There is no place in performance motors for tight parts. There is no break-in. We break our motors in for 15 or 20 minutes. We change our oil. We take it to the track, and we're spinning at 6, 7, 8,000 RPMs, okay? What happens is tightness creates heat. Heat ends it all, okay? Bearing problems, broken rods, it could be catastrophic, okay? if something doesn't fit right when you're putting it together, you will feel it. And if you don't feel it, you don't need to be assembling the motor. Okay? Have a pro do it that you trust. Okay? When I get a crankshaft and a set of connecting rods, I'm going to give you an example. A well-known brand of rods that are our American icon for a bird, if you know what kind of rod I'm talking about, H-beams that everybody uses, and they're a damn good rod. I have no problem with them, okay? But I was building a 400 small block one day and put those rods in and torqued them down, and I had no side clearance. I mean, zero side clearance. And again, the owner was impatient, and I said, I'm going to have to pull this back out. I pulled it back out. I dressed the rods as best I can. Sometimes I use air. Sometimes I use board with sandpaper on it to make more side clearance for the rods. Okay, what's acceptable side clearance? Okay, for a lower RPM motor and a lower horsepower motor, 7-8 thousandths is acceptable. It's even acceptable in a higher RPM motor. And then I have people tell me that, well, it's 15 or 18 thousandths side clearance. That's too much side clearance. Bullshit. I know a lot of stock eliminator racers that run 30 thousandths side clearance. Okay? So I'm not going to say that you can have too much side clearance, but don't worry about it if you put your rods together and they're both on the journal of the crank, and you can physically take it and go clink, 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 move it back and forth and actually hear it and feel it. Okay? That's good. Okay? If you put both rods on there and you've got to use a screwdriver and pry it back and forth and see maybe 1,000ths or 2,000ths, stop. Don't do it. Okay? Take it back apart. Make sure there's enough clearance. Okay? The second thing is when I put a crankshaft in, I use mics, and I mic the crank and I mic the bearings. And everyone says that's the foolproof way of doing it. And I've also had a guy tell me that, hey, plastic gauge does not work. It just doesn't work. Well, I did an experiment one time where I said, okay, I'm going to check it tonight. So I checked it, and it was at, with a mic, it was at like 2.996. Okay. I checked it with a plastic gauge, and it showed up at 3,000. Okay. That's pretty close. As a quick check, if you don't have a $300 set of mics, it's going to give you a good idea. Now, when I plastic gauge a bearing, I put it together with no oil. So there's no oil on the bottom of the crankshaft. There's no oil on the bearings. There's no nothing, because I want it to go metal to metal contact so I know how much there is. Now, I don't spin the crank. I put my plastic gauge on it. I bolt it down. I pull it off, and I measure it. Okay? Now, if I got my good clearance, again, like I said, I use mics. Here's another little trick I've learned. If you've got one that's a little tighter or a little looser than you want to, here's an old trick that sometimes works for me. What I'll do is I'll take the largest reading and the smallest reading and swap them. But when I swap bearings, I swap because the crush has already been set on the bearing. So I'll number the bearing. I'll number the bottom bearing 1 and the top bearing 2. So I know 1 and 2 stay together. And I'll take them, say it's in main journal number 1 and main journal number 4. There's 2 different sizes there. And I swap them over, okay? And believe it or not, a lot of times that fixes it. But the main thing that I do is once everything's cleaned up, once everything's put together, I'll take a very, very lightweight oil with no rear main seal in it, okay? And when I mean real light oil, I'm talking about like transmission fluid. I'll set the crank in, I'll torque my bearings, and I do a hand spin, Okay. Now, when I spin it with my hand and I let it go, I want to see it continue to spin. Okay. If it spins a half a turn, fine. If it spins a whole turn, that's fine too. This is also when I check my rear bearing, or if it's a middle bearing, clearance for the crankshaft to see how much walk there is in the crankshaft. If there's 5 to 7, I'm good. If there's not, and a lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, and I don't care because I've been doing it for 25 years and it works. I have a special hammer and I've got a piece of block that I use, and I'll smack the front of the crankshaft and I'll smack the back of the crankshaft, and guess what? I've got more clearance. Okay, what I did is I put a little crush on those thrust bearings, and it works. Now I have a crankshaft in that is mic'd properly or checked properly. The bearings are set, it's torqued, it spins freely. And I have my clearance that I need in my crankshaft, 7 to 10 thousandths of crank walk in it. Some people like a little tighter. Okay, that's fine. And I know my crank's right. Okay, it spins good, it feels good. My crank's done. Okay, that's it for today, and we'll carry on in the next segment. Thanks a lot.